computer. Let me just make sure. Yep, okay. All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to our summer event, Hidden History, Japanese Internment, and Other Asian American Witch Hunts. My name is Rachel Christ. I am the Director of Education here at the Salem Witch Museum.
And I'm Jill Christensen, the Assistant Director of Education.
So before we get started, we have just a couple of housekeeping announcements. So we are going to turn off our camera once we really get rolling. That's just so you can see the full PowerPoint. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll turn the camera back on at the end. We are recording this presentation and we are going to post it on YouTube. So if you want to watch it again, or you know someone who wanted to see it and can't be here, it will be available hopefully tomorrow. Our hope is to talk for about 45 minutes. Keep in mind, we may go a little bit over, but our goal is to keep it to 45 minutes. And then just a quick note on pronunciation. So we're going to do our best with pronunciation throughout this talk, but there may be times when we mispronounce a name or a word. So we just ask you to bear with us, and we apologize if there are mistakes along the way. So we are going to get started. I'm going to turn off the video. We decided to focus our summer event this year on Japanese internment in light of the rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans, which have spiked 150% since the COVID-19 pandemic began last year. The mission of our museum is to be the voice of the innocent victims of witch hunts from 1692 to the present day. While the majority of our museum focuses on historic witch trials, we also attempt to connect the lessons of these tragic events with more contemporary history and experiences. At the end of our exhibit, Witches Evolving Perceptions, we present a formula for a witch hunt, which can be used to understand the events of 1692, as well as three 20th century examples: the communist blacklists of the 1950s, the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s, which was largely blamed on the gay community, and the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. First, it's helpful to begin by defining a scapegoat. Merriam-Webster defines a scapegoat as, quote, one that bears the blame for others or one that is the object of irrational hostility, unquote. Today, we will be examining how Asian Americans became a scapegoat, an unfortunate reality which began long before World War II. We consulted a variety of resources while researching this topic. There are three books in particular which were essential for this research: Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakisaku Houston and her husband, James Houston, Years of Infamy, The Untold Story of America's Concentration Camps by Michi Nishiro Wegland, and They Called Us Enemy by George Takei. These books, written in three very different styles, were composed by individuals who experienced internment as children. We have chosen to include the words of the individuals who were there and experienced internment firsthand, and to use their descriptions whenever possible. Also, please be advised, these are really difficult topics, and we will be showing several images that include racist language and imagery. In the context of direct quotations, you will also hear the racial slur Jap. While this language and imagery is unsettling, it has been included so as to help us understand the extreme aggression and prejudice that has been directed towards these individuals for decades.
Throughout history, in times of economic stress or war or outbreaks of disease, the other is often scapegoated as the cause for trouble. One of the most famous witch hunts in American history was the internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans during World War II. During this period, approximately 120,000 Japanese people were placed into incarceration camps in the western interior of the country. 73% of those interned were United States citizens, forcibly taken away from their homes and imprisoned for months without trial or just cause. And 30,000 of those interned were children. This was a really difficult subject to research. When we began preparing this lecture, we were unaware of the long history of anti-Asian hate crimes in this country, both before and after World War II. Before we discuss Japanese internment specifically, we're going to take a brief look at the history of Asian immigration to America leading up to the war, as this is essential context. Chinese immigrants first came to the United States in the late 1840s during the gold rush. They were escaping the fallout from the opium wars, taxes, floods, and droughts in China, and hoped to find opportunity and a better life in America. According to PBS, just under 3,000 Chinese arrived in San Francisco in 1851, and over 20,000 came the following year. By the end of the decade, 35,000 Chinese people lived in San Francisco, or 1/10 of the population. White Californians grew concerned about the number of Chinese immigrants. In an effort to stem the tide, the local government created a foreign miners tax. Anti-Chinese crimes increased. In 1854, the Supreme Court extended a California law which prohibited African Americans and Native Americans from testifying in court to include Chinese people as well, so they couldn't defend themselves regarding violence against them. Construction on the Transcontinental Railroad got underway in the mid-1860s. The goal here was to connect rail lines working from Sacramento, California toward the east and from Omaha, Nebraska toward the west, some 1,600 miles, so train travel would be possible from coast to coast. The Central Pacific Railroad Company was working west to east, while the Union Pacific Railroad was working east to west. They would finally meet in Promontory, Utah in May of 1869. Central Pacific President Jay Crocker suggested hiring Chinese workers when it became apparent that not enough white men wanted to take on the dangerous and backbreaking job. Irish immigrants and Civil War vets were working for the Union Pacific on the easier path across the plains of Nebraska, although they did have to contend with attacks from Native people. Chinese workers numbered 20 to 50 in 1864 and had grown to 20,000, or 90% of the workforce, by the time the railroad was completed in 1869. Chinese workers were paid 30 to 50% less than white employees and also had to find their own food and housing, unlike their white colleagues. Dynamiting through the Sierra Nevada mountains was dangerous business. Over 1,000 Chinese workers died in accidents along the way. By 1870, 75% of the American Chinese population lived in California, largely in the northern part of the state, working in low-paying jobs like farming, fishing, laundries, and domestic work. The racist belief that Asian immigrants are taking white jobs started to increase, and Chinese immigrants were subjected to growing violence. One of the worst incidents was an 1871 massacre in Los Angeles, where approximately 175 Chinese people lived, making up 3% of the population. According to a fascinating blog at the Los Angeles Public Library, quote, more than half of the Chinese lived in the adobes along Calle de los Negros, or a Negro alley, named not for African Americans, but for the dark-skinned Spaniards who originally lived there. Negro Alley was the infamous vice district of Los Angeles. Saloons, gambling parlors, and brothels lined the short, unpaved alley just off the plaza, unquote. Beginning around 1869, the local LA newspapers had been printing editorials referring to the Chinese as inferior and immoral. In October of 1871, a shootout between two rival Chinese gangs in Negro Alley resulted in the accidental death of a white civilian. A mob numbering 500 converged on the building where the shooters were hiding, and when all was over, 18 Chinese men and boys had been lynched, only one of whom was thought to have taken part in the shooting. According to the Los Angeles Public Library blog, quote, though a grand jury returned 25 indictments for the murder of the Chinese, only 10 men stood trial. 8 rioters were convicted on manslaughter charges, but the charges were overturned on a legal technicality, and the defendants were never retried, unquote. Anti-Chinese sentiment grew during the ensuing years. After a depression in 1876, "They're taking our jobs" was once again a familiar refrain, and Congress acted, passing the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which restricted Chinese immigration for the next 60 years. It was signed into law by President Chester A. Arthur, and was the first and only US law ever passed to prevent all members of a specific ethnic or national group to immigrate to the United States. The law was not repealed until the Exclusion Act of 1943. Foreshadowing the racism targeting Asian Americans during the present pandemic, a bubonic plague outbreak in San Francisco in 1900 was blamed on the Chinese community because the first victim was a Chinese immigrant. Little did it matter that rats carrying plague-infested fleas were jumping from ships docking in San Francisco and heading for the most crowded and decrepit neighborhood they could find, Chinatown. Landlords at the time were loath to keep these neighborhoods in good repair. It's believed that the initial culprit was a flea-ridden rat who escaped from the steamship SS Australia arriving from Hawaii. This first plague epidemic in the United States claimed 119 lives. Early reaction from leadership was minimal. In fact, US Navy Surgeon General Van Ripen said, quote, "It's a disease peculiar to the Orient and seldom, if ever, attacks Europeans. There is absolutely no danger of the plague ever getting here," unquote. Apparently, the first signs of something wrong were dead rats in the streets. Another early sign of something amiss were the upper and middle class homes suddenly wondering where their servants were. Remarkably, the San Francisco Chronicle said, quote, "The Chinese were not the only people who had to suffer. The white employers of the Chinese awoke to find that there was nobody on hand to prepare breakfast," unquote. As prevailing wisdom held that the Chinese carried the disease, 25 to 35,000 Chinese people were quarantined in the 12-block Chinatown neighborhood, which was surrounded by rope preventing them from entering or exiting. Only Asian people were quarantined. White residents were permitted free movement. The plague's existence was denied for 2 years by California Governor Henry Gage, while at the same time he waged a defamation campaign against the Marine Hospital Service's lead quarantine officer, Joseph Kenyon. The plague intensified in 1901 and 2, during which time Gage accused Kenyon of falsifying evidence by injecting plague bacteria into corpses. Several San Francisco newspapers also denied the plague's existence, while another sensationalized its coverage. Although Kenyon was eventually forced out of his job, the United States Hygienic Laboratory that he founded grew into what we know today as the National Institutes of Health. For more than 200 years, from 1639 to 1853, Japan had been an isolationist country, keeping its culture and traditions closed to Europe and its colonies. When the United States Navy's Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Tokyo Harbor in 1853 and forced the country to open up to US trade, great change came to Japan, including rapid industrialization, agricultural decline, and social upheaval. Young Japanese workers began arriving on the west coast of the United States around 1885, where they filled the low-wage jobs in farming, fishing, and building railroads that had been previously handled by the cheap labor of Chinese immigrants over the preceding 30 years. They came looking to build a better, more prosperous life, but like the Chinese before them, they were met with racist anger, difficult working conditions, and legislative efforts to keep them in check. According to the Library of Congress, more than 400,000 Japanese people emigrated to the US or US-controlled lands between 1886 and 1911, with a significant number arriving for a decade after that. In 1907, Japanese immigration was restricted by a gentleman's agreement between the United States and Japan. President Theodore Roosevelt entered into the agreement with Japan to address the growing hostility against Japanese immigrants in California. Trouble had been brewing for a few years. In 1900, Japan agreed to deny passports to Japanese workers intent on going to the US. However, Japanese often traveled to Mexico, Canada, or Hawaii, and then on to the United States. In 1905, the San Francisco School Board placed all Asian children in segregated schools, which angered Japan. Roosevelt negotiated a truce of sorts in which Japan agreed to deny passports to Japanese workers and recognized the right of the US to deny entry to Japanese immigrants who had passports issued for other countries. During this time, racist organizations such as the Asiatic Exclusion League and the Anti-Jap Laundry League were created, indicating the surge in anti-Asian aggression. In 1913, legislation banned Japanese Americans from owning land or property, and shortly thereafter, the Immigration Act of 1924 was passed, which limited visas to 2% of any nationality and completely excluded immigrants from, quote, undesirable, unquote, Asian countries.
So this brings us to 1939, the start of World War II. As most of us know, at first the United States was hesitant to join the war. In the fall of 1941, many signs were pointing towards probable war with Japan. As a result, a secret report was commissioned by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to establish the loyalty of Japanese Americans living in the West Coast and Hawaii. The investigator who led this commission was Curtis B. Munson, whose 25-page report validated the findings of decades of military and domestic surveillance, which found there was not a shred of evidence to indicate Japanese Americans presented an internal threat to the United States government. In fact, as Michi Nishihiro Weglin notes, it found there was, quote, a remarkable, even extraordinary degree of loyalty among this generally suspect ethnic group, unquote. This report appears to have been buried, only resurfacing in 1946. When later considering the mass evacuation of Japanese from the West Coast, Attorney General of California, Earl Warren, made the statement, quote, we have no reports of spying or sabotage or fifth column activity by Japanese Americans, and that is ominous because the Japanese are inscrutable, unquote. On December 7th, 1941, Japan attacked the Pearl Harbor Naval Base on Oahu Island, Hawaii. This was a devastating and terrifying event in American history. In addition to the destruction of battleships, aircrafts, and other vessels, more than 2,400 individuals were killed. President Roosevelt would call this, quote, a date which will live in infamy, unquote. There are those still alive today who can remember this event, and I'm sure some of you recall hearing about it from your parents and grandparents. On December 8th, 1941, the United States declared war on Japan, signaling our entrance into World War II. While the destruction and devastation of this experience cannot be understated, the events which followed can only be described as scapegoating. In quick succession, actions were taken against Japanese people living in the United States. Suddenly, all individuals of Japanese ancestry were seen as suspicious and were treated as enemies of the country. Here are some wartime propaganda posters that vividly illustrate this sentiment. Within 48 hours of the attack, 1,291 Japanese community leaders were arrested by the FBI. While some were interrogated and released, many remained in custody and were shipped away to detention centers. Often, families did not know where their relatives had been taken or how long they would be gone. Jean Wakasaku Houston remembers this period vividly, as her father was among those arrested during this time. He was a commercial fisherman and as such was suspected of contacting enemy ships off the coast. The family did not know where he was or why he had been sent away, only discovering he had been accused of giving oil to Japanese submarines offshore when the news appeared in a Santa Monica newspaper. The family did not see him again until a year later. Here's a quote from Houston about this experience. To the FBI, every radio owner was a potential saboteur. The confiscators were often deputies sworn in hastily during the turbulent days right after Pearl Harbor, and these men seemed to be acting out the general panic, seeing sinister possibilities in the most ordinary household items: flashlights, kitchen knives, cameras, lanterns, toy swords. There were attempts by public officials and news outlets in the weeks after Pearl Harbor to promote tolerance. For example, the San Francisco News wrote, quote, in California, we have many citizens of Japanese parentage. A large proportion of them are native-born Americans. They must not be made to suffer for the sins of a government for whom they have no sympathy or allegiance, unquote. This plea for tolerance was unfortunately drowned out by the increasingly hostile calls for evacuation, caused by a mixture of greed and racial prejudice, which, as we've seen, had been hovering in plain sight for years. The fact that Japanese Americans were skilled farmers was resented by their local competition. Japanese Americans would often buy strips of unwanted and cheap land and turn them into fertile fields. While the law prohibited Japanese and Chinese immigrants from becoming United States citizens, and they could not legally own land due to the 1913 land law, many had begun to purchase property in the names of their American-born children. A combination of hard labor and centuries-old agricultural techniques led to their considerable success. Wegland states, quote, "In the course of the years, notably during periods of economic crisis, a hue and cry arose of unfair competition and accusations that the Japs had taken over the best land," unquote. The racist motivations behind calls for Japanese evacuation were blatant and openly asserted by those in the agricultural industry. Austin E. Anson, managing secretary of the Salinas Vegetable Grower Shipper Association, told the Saturday Evening Post in 1942, quote, "We're charged with wanting to get rid of the Japs for selfish reasons. We do. It's a question of whether the white man lives on the Pacific coast or the brown man. They come into this valley to work and they stayed to take over. If all the Japs were removed tomorrow, we'd never miss them in 2 weeks because the white farmers can take over and produce everything the Jap grows. And we do not want them back when the war ends either," unquote. Shops soon joined farmers in open aggression. They would display signs such as, quote, "This restaurant poisons both rats and Japs," and, quote, "Open hunting season for Japs," unquote. This particularly disturbing image comes from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum collection. These horrible cards were circulated in the 1940s, again illuminating the enormous surge of aggression directed towards Japanese individuals during this period. On February 19, 1942, Executive Order 9066 was issued by President Roosevelt. This order authorized the relocation of any person deemed a threat to undefined military areas. Though this did not mention any group or ethnicity explicitly, it quickly became apparent this order was to be applied to individuals of Japanese ancestry. This order came in the wake of a sequence of escalating actions targeting Japanese individuals. Curfews were imposed prohibiting those of Japanese ancestry from going outside between 8 p.m. and 6 a.m. In March, Public Proclamation No. 1 was issued by Lieutenant General John D. Dwight. This began the process of evacuating all people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast. This process was completed by June 2nd. It's relevant to note that this exclusion order could have been used to intern those of German and Italian ancestry, as we were of course also at war with these countries. However, while some German and Italian individuals living on the West Coast were arrested, they were each given an individual hearing and few went to internment camps. As a result of this executive order, 120,000 Japanese people were removed to remote locations in the interior of the United States. Of those in turn, 73% were American citizens. The main argument behind this decision was that within these relocation centers, individuals could be kept under surveillance, restricted from using traditional forms of communication, and the physical relocation would eliminate the threat of these individuals assisting in an additional attack. Wegland describes the evacuation process as, quote, "utter chaos." Families were given between 1 week and 10 days to arrange for the care of their homes and businesses and to store or sell their possessions. Many were forced to sell possessions at a fraction of their cost, and after the war would return to storage facilities that had been ransacked or destroyed. Wegland goes on to note, quote, "A post-war survey was to reveal that 80% of goods privately stores were rifled, stolen, or sold during absence," unquote. Richard Reeves, author of Infamy, The Shocking Story of the Japanese-American Internment in World War II, notes there were sympathetic and brave civilians during this dark period who attempted to protect the property of their neighbors and friends. For example, in Florin, California, the fire chief, Bob Fletcher, quote, "took real risks to protect the property of his American-Japanese former neighbors, while other white men were taking over their land or burning down their houses and vandalizing the depositories filled with the possessions of the incarcerated, usually churches and Buddhist temples." During evacuation, each family was given a number. This was to be their official designation during transportation and while imprisoned. Families were given a tag with their number to wear and a place on their luggage. One can only imagine how demoralizing this experience must have been. A note on language. We most commonly refer to detention centers as internment camps, though some argue they should instead be referred to as concentration camps. Richard Reeves includes a helpful definition of these terms. He notes, quote, In legal terminology, internment applies only to government regulation of aliens, not citizens, and more than 2/3 of the American Japanese rounded up in 1942 were citizens of the United States. However, the word internment was commonly used to describe the detention of both citizens and aliens during the war. The term concentration camp was commonly used in government offices during those years to describe the 10 officially named relocation centers around the country. Among those who called them concentration camps was the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, unquote. However, he also goes on to say, quote, the term concentration camp changed forever because of the death camps of Nazi-occupied Europe, unquote, though Americans used these terms interchangeably in the early 1940s. There were three main types of facilities used during internment: Department of Justice camps, WCCA assembly centers, and WRA relocation centers. Assembly centers were temporary facilities used to assemble and organize internees before their transportation to the more permanent WRA relocation centers. All but 4 of the 15 assembly center locations had previously been racetracks or fairgrounds. In preparation for the internees' arrival, the stables and livestock areas were cleaned and converted into living quarters for families of up to 6. Wood and tar paper barracks were constructed, along with communal latrines, hastily built laundry facilities, and mess halls. Between March and August of 1942, 92,193 Japanese Americans were transferred to these centers. The largest assembly center was the Santa Anita Racetrack, located just outside Los Angeles. You can see these 2 images from this assembly center here. In this center, evacuees lived in a converted racetrack and cleared out stables. Hospital records indicate 75% of the illnesses in this camp were a result of living in these converted horse stalls. It was at this center that George Takei was sent with his family in the spring of 1942. As many of you may know, George Takei became famous as an adult for his portrayal of Sulu on the popular sci-fi series Star Trek. Takei writes about this experience in his graphic novel, They Called Us Enemy. Describing their arrival at this center, he notes, quote, each family was assigned a horse stall still pungent with the stink of manure. As a kid, I couldn't grasp the injustice of the situation, but for my parents, it was a devastating blow. They had worked so hard to buy a 2-bedroom house and raise a family in Los Angeles, and now we were crammed into a single smelly horse stall. It was a degrading, humiliating, and painful experience, unquote. His young sister became very sick in these conditions, as did he, though they both survived. Upon arrival, evacuees were shocked after their long journeys to find they were to be confined behind barbed wire, guarded by men with guns. To add insult to injury, in several cases, construction of the fences began after evacuees had already begun to arrive, meaning they had to watch as every day they were gradually fenced in with barbed wire. The armed guards did not patrol inside the camp and instead stayed within the guard towers and perimeter. Nevertheless, this did not eliminate all contact, and there were reports of shootings. In her memoir, Farewell to Manzanar, Houston remembers Manzanar, the internment camp where she lived throughout the war, as ill-equipped for habitation upon their arrival. Here's a description of the camp in her words, quote, we were taken to Block 16, a cluster of 15 barracks that had just been finished a day or so earlier, although finished was hardly the word for it. The shacks were built of one thickness of pine planking covered with tar paper. They sat on concrete footings with about 2 feet of open space between the floorboards and the ground. Gapes showed between the planks, and as the weeks passed and the green wood dried out, the gaps widened. Knotholes gaped in the uncovered floor. Each barracks was divided into 6 units, 16 by 20 feet, about the size of a living room, with one bare bulb hanging from the ceiling and an oil stove for heat. We were assigned 2 of these for the 12 people in our family group, and our official family number was enlarged by 3 digits, 16 plus the number of this barracks. We were issued steel army cots, 2 brown army blankets each, and some mattress covers, which my brothers stuffed with straw. It was bitter cold when we arrived, and the wind did not abate. All they had to use for room dividers were those army blankets, 2 of which were barely enough to keep one person warm. Another particularly vivid description from Farewell to Manzanar describes an unpleasant and very harsh aspect of these camps, the bathroom facilities. Houston notes, quote, I was sick continually with stomach cramps and diarrhea. At first, it was from the shots they gave us for typhoid in very heavy doses and in assembly line fashion. Swab, jab, swab, move along now, swab, jab, swab, keep it moving. That knocked all of us younger kids down at once with fevers and vomiting. Later, it was the food that made us sick, young and old alike. The kitchens were too small and badly ventilated. Food would spoil from being left out too long. The Manzanar runs became a condition of life, and you only hoped that when you rushed to the latrine, one would be in working order, unquote. She goes on to remember the first time she and her mother tried to use the latrine. She says, quote, each block was built to the same design, just as each of the 10 camps from California to Arkansas was built to a common master plan. It was an open room over a concrete slab. The sink was a long metal trough against one wall with a row of spigots for hot and cold water. Down the center of the room, 12 toilet bowls were arranged in 6 pairs, back to back with no partitions. My mother was a very modest person, and this was going to be agony for her, sitting down in public among strangers, unquote. Eventually, the camps became slightly more hospitable, though of course these individuals were imprisoned behind bars, unable to leave or move freely, and were guarded by armed army personnel. One of the details that is frequently included in the memoirs of internment is the resilience of the Japanese people. Though unjustly arrested, imprisoned, and demoralized, they made the best of this situation, eventually creating environments in which children and adults could grow. As evacuees settled into life in the camps, inhabitants with any sort of specialized knowledge volunteered for much needed position, taking posts such as cooks, doctors, dentists, and carpenters. Eventually, schools were opened and gradually clubs, activities, and organizations were formed for both children and adults. Over time, some camps even had churches, glee clubs, choirs, newspapers, bands, football games, and school plays. Houston attended Manzanar High, an institution that eventually had blackboards, textbooks, and even lab supplies, and was able to participate in a choir and learn how to twirl a baton. With that being said, all group meetings were required to be conducted in English, never in Japanese, and books written in Japanese, aside from religious texts, were confiscated. By February 3rd, 1943, the American Army needed more troops and thus began to allow Japanese Americans to serve in the military. However, they first had to prove they were loyal citizens by filling out a questionnaire. These were mandatory for all adults in internment camps. They asked about criminal records, relatives in Japan, and so on, but most importantly asked 2 provocative questions. Number 27, are you willing to serve the armed forces of the United States on combat duty whenever ordered? And number 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, to any foreign government, power, or organization? These questions asked if, after having been wrongfully arrested and imprisoned in a direct violation of their civil rights, they would risk their lives serving in the United States military. This provoked extreme reaction in the camps. About 8,500 people answered no to both questions. These respondents were labeled disloyal and sent to the Tule Lake Relocation Center. Among these respondents were George Takei's parents. Takei writes, quote, my father was raised in America but had been born in Japan. Like all Asian immigrants, he was forbidden for applying for US citizenship. Question 27 asked him to serve in combat for a country that had rejected and then imprisoned him because of his ethnicity. Question 28 asked him to discard his entire Japanese heritage, relatives, memories, and the place of his birth for a country that would not have him. Answering yes would make him stateless. However, there were those who answered yes, yes, and many Japanese Americans went out to fight for their country. Despite all that had happened, they were still passionate patriots and wanted to fight. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team is one of the most striking examples of Japanese service during World War II. This regiment was comprised entirely of Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans. The motto of this unit was "Go for broke," meaning put it all on the line no matter what. This regiment remains the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in the history of the U.S. military. In total, this unit of 18,000 men was awarded more than 4,000 Purple Hearts, 4,000 Bronze Stars, 560 Silver Star Medals, 21 Medals of Honor, and 7 Presidential Unit Citations. In 2010, Congress passed Bill S-1055, which awarded all members of this division the Congressional Gold Medal for their service in World War II. The National World War II Museum states, quote, "Despite the years of suspicion and racism that prevailed at home, these Nisei men fought for their country and their ideals of freedom and democracy. They fought heroically, leaving behind a record that is still untouched today," unquote. Here we see an image of President Harry Truman saluting the 442nd Regiment. As he addressed these brave troops, President Truman stated, quote, "You not only fought the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won," unquote.
On January 2nd, 1945, the exclusion order was finally rescinded. Though free to leave, closing the camps posed certain questions about how to reintroduce these individuals back into society. Having been taken away from their homes, losing many, if not all, of their possessions, and faced with returning to communities that stepped aside or even advocated for their exclusion, many were uneasy about reassimilating into society. The government issued former inmates a train ticket. Though they could have returned to their pre-war residences, many had little or nothing to return to, having lost their homes and businesses during the evacuation. In 1948, the Japanese-American Evacuation Claims Act was passed, which provided some compensation for lost property. And in 1952, it became legal for immigrants of Asian ancestry to naturalize as US citizens. While positive steps, this was not a public apology or acknowledgement of the wrongdoing of these years. In their memoirs, both Houston and Takei remember the challenges of returning to society. Takei recounts a teacher who referred to him as, quote, "that little Jap boy," unquote, and treated him with contempt. Houston remembers, quote, "choosing friends often depended upon whether or not I could be invited to their homes, whether their parents would allow this," unquote. In the 1970s, there was a surge of interest in the next generation of Japanese Americans about the internment. They began to question their parents and grandparents, many of whom never felt comfortable discussing the experience with their children. John Tateshi, who was imprisoned in the Manzanar Relocation Center as a child, notes when these individuals learned about these events and asked their parents, most would say, "Shikata ganai," it can't be undone. In an interview with NPR, he reflected it was the dedication and persistence of this generation which brought national attention to these injustices. Tateshi notes, quote, "The one thing that resonated for the Nisei generation was the message that this is not about us. This is an issue that is about the Constitution and the future of this country. We were determined to pass the Civil Liberties Act as a way of having Americans recognize the injustices of what happened to us, not for our sake, but in order to make sure this never happened again," unquote. In many of the accounts we have read about internment, the author notes the resistance in subsequent years, as many either refused to believe the camps ever existed to begin with or maintained they were necessary. Houston recalls when she published her book in the 1970s, she was often faced with comments such as, quote, "It's too bad the Japanese got locked up, but that's what happens in wartime. After all, what do you expect? Didn't your people do the same thing to our soldiers, putting them in those terrible camps over there in the Philippines," unquote. To this, she and her husband would have to patiently explain the difference, saying, quote, "Most of the Americans interned in the Philippines were military personnel captured in an overseas combat zone, prisoners of war held by enemy troops. Most of those interned in the United States were native-born American citizens. They were all civilians imprisoned inside the borders of their own country without a trial, and their captors were other Americans," unquote. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan formally apologized for the internment and authorized payment of $20,000 to each camp survivor. This legislation admitted the government's actions were based on, quote, "race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership," unquote. In total, the US dispersed more than $1.6 billion in reparations to 82,219 Japanese Americans. George Takei notes it was not until 1991 that he received a letter of apology and a check for $20,000. Did people's behavior change after World War II was over and the internment camps were closed? Did hate crimes disappear or at least diminish? Sadly, no. Less than a decade after World War II ended, the conflict that came to be known as the Vietnam War began in 1954. 21 years later, in April of 1975, the Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam captured Saigon in South Vietnam and renamed it Ho Chi Minh City. The fall of Saigon marked the end of the protracted conflict, which saw the deaths of over 58,000 American soldiers, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, 1.1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters, and 2 million North and South Vietnamese civilians. Prior to Saigon's capture, the largest helicopter evacuation in history brought to safety almost all of the American military and civilian personnel who were left. The ground troops had left 2 years earlier, as well as tens of thousands of South Vietnamese civilians who had been associated with the South Vietnamese government. The Vietnamese refugees did not have a smooth entry into the United States. The Journal of American Ethnic History notes, quote, anticipating political and presumably personal freedom within the United States, numerous refugees found themselves unexpectedly waiting days and at times weeks and months in military compounds, unquote. The US sponsored the evacuation of about 125 to 130,000 refugees in total. According to the Migration Policy Institute, more and more displaced people from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia were admitted into the US over the following years. As of 2017, about 1.3 million Vietnamese were living in the US, the sixth largest foreign-born group in the country. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Vietnamese shrimp and crab farmers based in Texas were harassed and intimidated by Ku Klux Klan members who burned their boats and told the newcomers to get out of town. Although some of the Vietnamese fled in fear, today there is a thriving Vietnamese community along the Gulf Coast and a community of 80,000 Vietnamese living in Houston. Mike Trin, owner of Mike's Seafood in Houston's Little Saigon, was quoted on NPR about the Vietnamese community in Texas. Quote, all I can say is the immigrant mentality, we work our butt off for everything. We carve a niche out of nothing, unquote. By now, we're probably realizing how the words of our local and national leaders have a great influence on the American people. Although he certainly deserved praise for approving reparations for Japanese internment camp survivors in 1988, President Ronald Reagan used rhetoric earlier that decade regarding the economic recession, which increased animosity toward Japan. UC Berkeley sociology professor Andrew Barlow on the PBS NewsHour earlier this year noted, quote, probably the classic example was the success of Ronald Reagan in weaponizing anti-Japanese sentiments in the early 1980s to explain the collapse of the manufacturing sector of the United States, which he argued was caused by Japanese unfair competition, unquote. During this recession, two white men in Detroit beat a young Chinese American with a bat so badly he died of his injuries a few days later. They picked their bar fight with Vincent Chin because, quote, the Japanese, unquote, were taking their auto industry jobs. The men were sentenced to probation and fined. Not only do people blame the other for their problems, entire groups are saddled with grievances. In the case of Asian Americans, Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, and Indians are often interchangeable to people who are looking for a scapegoat. After 9/11, according to the Washington Post, quote, hate crime spiked against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim, including people of South Asian descent, unquote. A Sikh American gas station owner was murdered days after the attacks, mistaken for a Muslim. It's wrong to scapegoat an entire group of people for their religious beliefs, and here's another example of scapegoating people because they look different. Anti-Muslim attacks have increased again in recent years. As we said at the start, hate crimes against Asian Americans have increased 150% during the COVID pandemic. PBS noted there were about 100 cases of anti-Asian attacks per day in April 2020. Human nature doesn't need encouragement to look for scapegoats in times of trouble, but again, rhetoric like Kung flu and Chinese virus has an enormous impact. In addition, the mass shooting in Atlanta in March of 2020, where 6 of the victims were Asian women working in Asian-run massage parlors, highlights the plight of such workers. It's interesting to note the very first American immigration law was the Page Exclusion Act of 1875, which, according to Open Society Foundation's, quote, unapologetically excluded East Asian women from the country because of stereotypes that they were sex workers and temptations for white men, unquote. And so we have racism and sexism intertwined in this example of scapegoating. Just over 1 year after the Atlanta shootings, President Biden signed legislation addressing hate crimes, a hopeful first step in addressing the recent surge in anti-Asian aggression. This brings us to the end of our presentation, in which we have only scraped the surface of this difficult and complex topic. Here's an amazing quote from George Takei. I had to learn about the internment from my father during our after-dinner conversations. That remains part of the problem, that we don't know the unpleasant aspects of American history, and therefore we don't learn the lessons those chapters have to teach us. So we repeat them over and over again. Hate is learned. People are not born with it. When we don't educate ourselves about other people's experiences and traditions and beliefs, it's easy to erase them, to disregard them, and in the worst cases, treat them as less than human. To reiterate our witch hunt formula, fear plus a trigger equals a scapegoat. What we have learned while researching this particular talk is that we all have a lot to learn. We never knew about many of the terrible anti-Asian hate crimes from the past. Studying history is so important and hopefully makes us all better citizens of the world. To end on a positive note, we have 3 pictures of present-day Asian Americans who have done amazing things and who we find inspiring.
So rather than doing a Q&A, because we're not specialists on this topic, we're going to direct you to resources that have been written by experts. So here's a list of some helpful books and articles for further learning. And please feel free to take a screenshot. I will also post this list on the Facebook group, so that'll be up hopefully tomorrow. 2 of these books, Farewell to Manzanar and They Called Us Enemy, are available on our online store, and these are both great books for learners of all ages. And I also want to reiterate what a difficult subject this was to research. You hear all the time that we study history for the purpose of learning from our past mistakes. And that is much easier when we're studying an event that happened 300 years ago, as opposed to something that happened in our own time. We learned so much while working on this presentation, and we hope you did too. So thank you everyone for coming to this presentation. Again, this recording will be up tomorrow, and we hope you all have a great rest of your evening. So we want to stop recording.